Hi, Dennis Weiss for Eagle Communications, and why like Ike? Why not, as we say. Tim Reeves, Pam Sanfilippo, and we have interesting stuff on the table in front of us, although miniaturized. Be hard to get a B-52 in here, Tim.
They've been deactivated, so they're safe.
Deactivated, and a nuclear submarine might have been a little tough to get in the room. And the first missile that was launched off a submarine, and obviously not to scale either. A lot of things to talk about Eisenhower and Project Solarium, and I'll let you kick us off.
Well, it dates back to Ike's earliest days in office. Of course, he inherited the Cold War, which was that conflict that began late in World War II between the Western Allies, primarily the United States and the Soviet Union. And then, of course, a few years after that one, also developed the Cold War with China, or Red China, as they called it at the time. One problem was, and the problem that bothered Ike about the previous administration, was the cost. And Eisenhower was always concerned, well, he hated deficits, he hated the idea of inflation, and he had this idea that deficits would eventually lead to tyranny because there's so little in a society to distribute, that the government winds up doing it, and on down the road was
he
his
right
thing.
About that?
Well, we'll leave that to other historians to judge. And one reason he ran for president, in fact, the main reason, he'd been on the fence. And Senator Robert Taft of Ohio was the leading Republican candidate. He represented the old guard, the conservative wing of the party. Eisenhower's sympathies lay with what was called the Eastern establishment, the moderate to liberal Republicans. But what really drove him to run, he went to visit Senator Taft and said, if you will support these new international defense organizations, such as NATO primarily, then I won't run. And he even brought a letter saying he wouldn't run, and Senator Taft said he could not support that. And so Eisenhower really ran to preserve those international alliances. And we have an interesting poster here directed towards U.S. soldiers, telling them about the role they play and how to behave when they're in France. Another big issue to Ike was the establishment of the EDC, the European Defense Community, which would have allied more Western countries together in yet another defense pact. And so, the Cold War was a reality of Eisenhower's 8 years in office, and paying for it was a big priority. And so when he first began, back up just a moment, in March, he'd just taken office in January of '53. In March of '53, Joseph Stalin, the Soviet premier, died. And they thought there'd be a real opening in relations at that time, and Eisenhower gave a famous speech called A Chance for Peace, and talked about how this is our chance to reduce all this crazy spending, and talked about how the cost of one heavy bomber could pay for 60 schools or 30 hospitals, and he really drove that point home of how expensive it is. Then a couple months later, he has a meeting with Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, and tellingly included in that meeting is Secretary of the Treasury George Humphrey, because again, everything Ike did also had that financial factor behind it. Right. And they met in the solarium at the White House. And so this exercise that we'll talk about became known as Project Solarium. And we have a really interesting 8-page memo. And you can hear the alarm in John Foster Dulles' remarks to Eisenhower. Point number one, it's difficult to conclude that time is working in our favor. Number two, practically everywhere one looks, there is a strong holding point and danger everywhere of communist penetration. South America is vulnerable. West Germany might take the communist bait and block the European defense community. Incalculable factors change the pattern of the future and dislocate red plans. And here's kind of the key. The existing threat posed by the Soviets in the Western world is the most terrible and fundamental in the latter's 1,000 years of domination. This threat differs in quality from the threat of Napoleon or Hitler. It is more like the invasion of Islam in the 10th century. Now the clear issue is, can Western civilization survive? So the stakes could not have been higher to
Not
Dulles.
exactly a tuna fish and chips meeting, was it?
No, it was not. And goes on again for several pages with Ike giving his comments as well. And finally, Ike decides, towards the end of the meeting, he said he would like to see set up some teams of bright young fellows, each team to take an alternative with each team to tackle its alternative with a real belief in it, just the way a good advocate tackles a law case. And then when the teams are prepared, each team should put in on some White House room with maps, et cetera. So his idea, and he also often did this in the Army, it's like, okay, here are 3 options. You guys take these and flesh them out, then come back and present it to me. We'll discuss it, and we'll come to some kind of consensus. Of course, Eisenhower was very big on consensus building. And so they named this team. I think we could even get into some of the personalities. And they begin meeting in the summer of 1953, and they go for 6 weeks and working 12 to 14 hours a day. And the 3 options they're given to explore, Team A looked at continuing Truman's policy of containment, which was basically not let the Soviet Union expand any more than it has. Number 2 was almost retaliation. It was, we're going to draw a line in the sand here, and if the Soviets cross it, we'll let them know that everything's on the table, including nuclear weapons. Number 3 was called liberation or rollback, which had actually been a plank in the Republican platform in '52. And that was to very aggressively, especially with covert operations, attempt to overthrow existing communist regimes. And so Ike wanted a plan developed out of those 3 options. And Pam can talk about some of the folks who, I think all men, of course, at that time, who composed those teams.
Yes, yeah, and each one included military, Task Force A members, containment, were to have an intimate understanding of the past policies and actions of the United States, the rest of the free world, and the USSR, and broad gauge political, military, economic, and psychological planning for the future. I mean, really detailed, and the individuals were former ambassadors, State Department officials, Navy, Army, military individuals, graduates of military academy, law degree, someone who had worked in the Moscow embassy prior to that, so very significant.
One point, Pam, you mentioned the propaganda. We have an example of this here, contrasting the freedom of the West with the totalitarian regimes of the Soviets. And Eisenhower was big on public relations, not only domestically, because he believed that you could do things by persuasion then that wouldn't require government coercion.
Right.
And then, of course, the same technique was used during the Cold War. United States Information Agency and other agencies that could get the U.S. message out there internationally.
Yeah, and this poster is, why? Have you ever wondered why must communists build walls and fences? And each of the subsequent whys ask that question.
To keep people in.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You think of, you hear the word propaganda and you think pejorative.
Right.
Propaganda, more thoughtfully defined as the use of information to present a point of view.
Right.
And that is the essential elements of free debate.
Well, they distinguish between white propaganda and black propaganda. And the black propaganda is, of course, just propaganda as we might think of it, and that's in a pejorative sense.
It's always fascinating, and because we're exposed probably more than the average viewer anyway behind the camera to Eisenhower and his life. But every time we shoot one of these, it's just fascinating to think of that man having all of the years of his military life and political life to use his greatest gifts that God had gave him, the ability to organize, the ability to mediate between people, and then frankly, I think so often missing today, the ability to simply make a decision. His aim of putting those 3 groups together was not a 10 months worth of free lunch at the White House. It was to get to a decision point and then act, and he was very good at that.
Well, and I think too, it's a acknowledgement of his decision-making process, that he couldn't be an expert on all of these different subjects, so he called in the best and the brightest from the nation, put them on each of these 3 teams, and then listened to their reports, and each one of them came out with 300 to 400 page reports at the end of a long 6 weeks of work, and then they presented the information to Eisenhower in one day, about 9 hours worth. He didn't take a single note. He listened to each of their arguments for their particular option that they had studied, and at the end of it came out and was able to clearly and concisely summarize what each of those options were and then make his decision.
And the decision was elements of all three, of course, in
Sure,
good Eisenhower
of
fashion.
course.
We maintain, in large part, the containment policy of President Truman. In terms of option B, which included the use of nuclear weapons, we cut the size of the military forces, but we increased those weapons. That's where the phrase "bigger bang for the buck" comes from. And then we did, he did employ covert operations where possible, such as in Iran and Guatemala, because, well, for one thing, it avoided a larger war and it was more cost effective. And again, this was all known as the New Look defense policy. But again, as Pam said, it's just such a great example of his decision-making process, how he would build consensus among a group and then make a decision. But then, of course, he also had this favorite story about Abraham Lincoln and how Lincoln would hold a cabinet meeting and then go around the table for everyone's comments, and it would be no, 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 and Lincoln would say, "The ayes have it." So the point is, in the end, he was in charge.
Sure.
And he appreciated their input, and he would digest that and see where it worked and what he had in mind. But in the end, it was on him against probably our most famous document, which is that in case of failure note that he wrote the night before D-Day.
Right.
When something goes wrong, we're not going to form a committee and see where the system broke down and where the mistakes were made. No, if it goes wrong, it's on me. So he was very much on the positive side of that, of taking charge, but then also taking responsibility if it failed.
True
We're going to turn this section into how to do economic revitalization, and you didn't know this was planned, did you? So I look at what you have just described about Eisenhower and his decision-making path, and here's the phrase that clued me in. He didn't take a single note.
No.
I would present a thought process about that. Eisenhower, as I have read of his work in the military, he always knew the position of people, what they thought, what they recommended before that meeting came along. And so he was always gathering information from various sources. And so he would have been in that meeting with a good idea of what the people he selected for those committees thought about things, and had put all of that through his gifted mind and had a draft of what he thought as a leader. And he was looking to see if we had done the documentation, the validation of all those thoughts in order to make a coherent plan that was, again, balanced with all of the points of view to create the best opportunity for success. And it was just a genius. And if you're ever looking how to solve a thorny problem in a community, that's how you do it. You have to have a leader. And you have to have somebody who knows what the facts are about the process and about the problems and what the solutions are, but has a vision. He will need help, she will need help to put that together, but if you don't have that person with that vision, you're probably lost in the community development world.
And a clear indication that he had that, exactly as you're saying, is that each of these teams was given a set of questions to consider as they developed their reports, and what results can be expected from this option, what about this option could be made public and what needs to be kept secret, how would the Soviet Union leaders be expected to react to this option, Red China, what is the risk of general war, and they had to be prepared to argue their position on each of these questions. It was a tremendous undertaking for them, but he had a clear idea.
I'm sorry. I'll probably mangle this quote, but the gist of it is, and it was one of Eisenhower's favorite on leadership, is that the key to leadership is to get your subordinates to do what you want them to do, that make them think it's their idea. And so there are some scholars who would say that Eisenhower knew all along what he wanted to do in terms of his defense policy, and this whole Project Solarium was a way to make them think it's almost their idea too. And so you could see that side of Eisenhower at work. And another thing I want to add before I forget it is that the world did not know about Project Solarium until the mid-1980s. This was all restricting and classified until the mid-1980s.
We didn't do a very good sales pitch on that. So let's repeat it. They're hearing information today that was classified right up until the 80s. And that process is ongoing here at the library. There's information being declassified all the time that can be presented to the public or public can have access to. It's one of the tremendous benefits of having this facility here in our hometown as well.
And by the way, some of the material is still restricted.
Sure.
Even after all these years.
Sure.
And
so we have the Nike there in front of us. We didn't talk about the Nike.
No, we didn't.
And we're not going to get any patent complaints or trademark complaints from Nike, the shoes, today, are we? Because that was around long before the tennis shoes.
That's right, and a good deal faster than Nike
Yeah,
shoes,
it
too.
did, even with Michael Jordan in it.
Yeah, but yeah, this is obviously a small model. And the Nike missile was actually anti-aircraft and would intercept any Soviet or Chinese bombers attempting to...
Again, a first. They're first. All the little models are all things that had never been done before, other than probably that little wing device over there that Dave will get a shot of later. That was probably a Werner von Braun knockoff of the V1.
Well, as our museum staff told us, of the V1 that the Nazis developed during the war, and then it became the first submarine-based missile.
Right.
And instead of like the ones that are now launched from underwater, they had to surface in order to launch this one.
Yeah.
So that was an early form of it. Then, of course, the famous B-52, still in operation today.
Yeah. As I told you just before the camera came on, this is as we all know, this is a very still much important piece of our arsenal today. And
Still use them.
we lost one in an accident in Guam yesterday. Nobody was hurt, thank you, Lord, but we did lose the plane. So many of the things that we experience every day are still from the Eisenhower administration and from his vision of our country are around us everywhere, not just in a museum.
That's a fact.
Yep, that's a fact. Okay, Project Solarium was the topic that we talked about today, and gosh, we could do a series on this one. You really have my interest piqued. I look at the propaganda in front of Pam over there, and if everybody in our country today read those questions and answered them, we'd all be better students of the world, wouldn't we?
Still a lot to learn from the Eisenhower era,
Yeah,
no doubt.
Yeah.
And if we've got time, Tim and some other staff here, before I arrived, created a book on Project Solarium that we use with school groups
Oh, really?
now. And I have them form teams and do this same exercise, and they have to present to the others and try and get them to come up with the idea of combining options.
Glad you brought that up.
Will you take a couple minutes and just explain, using that project, what you do with young people here and why it's so important?
Sure. With this particular project, the booklet has some of the background information, the differences between the United States and the Soviet Union regarding values, property ownership, decision-making, and wealth. So it gives them that background that they need before they can get into the project. And then we divide them into the 3 teams. Each one has background information on who was on their team, what option they're arguing for. They're given a little bit of time to work in their groups to formulate their argument. Then they have to get up and present their argument to one another. Then what I've done is had them, after they've heard all this and asked questions of each other, had them get into 3 separate areas of the room and start a debate going to try and get one or the other to move from one position to the other.
Right.
My goal is always that someone in the group will say, well, you know, we've got some similarities. How about if we form a 4th group? And I've had that happen several times. And then I'm able to present to them what Eisenhower's decision was to combine those, and it's great.
Because you do this every day, it may seem like it's what you do, but I want people who don't understand or haven't had the opportunity to be exposed is our local high school students have a chance to come here and do these things. And again, not that you couldn't ship the curriculum around the world via the internet, but here they can not only experience the decision making and the learning, but they can see the artifacts and it becomes real to them very quickly. My son went through the sophomore project this year, and again, it became very real to him what he was studying about Eisenhower in the Middle East in the 50s and 60s, and that was something that he went from just esoteric knowledge in his head to head and heart knowledge, and that will live with him forever. What a great project.
Another great experience for them. They will often find documents that contradict something they've read.
Yeah,
and it's
or
like,
something their dad has told them.
Yeah, and so it's like, well, this doesn't match what this historian said. They get to make that decision on their own.
Yeah.
Another great thing about the Project Solarium booklet that Pam mentioned, they not only get the content of the Cold War and Project Solarium, they get to participate in that decision-making process.
Yeah.
So it's an excellent program.
So exciting. This has been a great Why Like Ike and Project Solarium. So much to get excited about for a young man like me, right?
Right.
So B-52s and nuclear submarines and anti-aircraft, anti-space missiles, all that stuff is very cool. There's so much here, folks, for you to see and learn, and for your children to be exposed to like mine was. We sure appreciate you watching Why Like Ike, and I'm Dennis Weiss. I work for Eagle Communications. Tim Reeves, Pam Sanfilippo. We're hoping you have a great day.